Okay, so hopefully you're here for this talk. If you're not, well, Anyway, like you mentioned, I started out as a developer for 10 plus years, 12, 13, however long it was. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've been more focused on application security. I've written about it, I've blogged about it, I've spoke about it, all sorts of good stuff. And I'm an AppSec engineer for Duo/Cisco, so I'm sure everybody heard about that. Okay, so legacy applications. I'd like to ask this question. How many people in here are working with a legacy application right now? Okay, who's not? There's always one or two. And usually they work for marketing companies, but I know that's not the case for you. But anyway, so basically we want to take these legacy applications that pretty much everybody has to deal with at some point and modernize them so that we can make them as secure as possible. But one of the keys to this is keeping things simple. It's really easy to introduce a whole bunch of controls into your system and not have them be effective and have this super complex thing that you have to worry about every single moving piece inside of. It's a whole lot easier if you can figure out exactly the controls and exactly the things you need and then implement only those. Now, in a legacy system, you may have this wide range of controls that you have to take and you have to minimize down. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways to kind of reduce that and, and hopefully help the situation. But just keep this in mind during the whole presentation that complexity is one of the biggest enemies of security. The more complex your system is, the more chance it's going to have something in there that the attacker can exploit. And obviously, you want the security of your application to go up and the risk to go down. That's the whole point of refactoring. Refactoring in general is to make your application better. Security refactoring is to make, obviously, the security and the hardening of your application more robust. So to start off with, if you have your application and you're only familiar with a certain part of it, you have to go in and you have to try to figure out how you can understand the scope of the application. You're going to have the authentication controls, your data backend, the output layers, any kind of input from users to APIs, anything you're using there. And then you're going to have your business logic. And then you're going to have everything else in your application that kind of glues all this stuff together. If you don't have a good picture of how all this links together and how all this is set up, you're going to have a seriously hard time trying to make a coherent security plan for your application. Especially these pieces that are in this circle here. If you don't have a good grasp of what those controls are, then you're going to have a really difficult time with this. So one of the recommendations I make is kind of working from the outside in. The user-facing pieces of the application are usually the easiest to start with, because you're going to have all these pieces, all the the pages and everything, or whatever the application is, that's going to be out there, and you can see where users are going to input information, the functionality of the application, how they're going to interact with it. And then you can kind of start working your way in, and you can start looking for those security controls that are in there to take care of those issues that might come in. I'm a big advocate for threat modeling. I had to shorten this presentation down because I had a whole section on threat modeling. There's tons of good documentation out there. I can definitely point you at some good stuff. There's a whole book that's about this thick just on threat modeling that is excellent. And for those not familiar with what threat modeling is, essentially you're breaking your pieces of your application down into parts. You're saying this is where the data is coming from, this is a functional piece, and here's where they connect. It's that connecting point, essentially, that's where you want to have your controls. So if it's from a database layer to the application layer, then obviously the usual credentials are going to be one of the simplest forms of having an access control between those two. With a threat model, you get up and you draw it out, or there's tools that you can use online to draw it out. And again, I've got some good stuff for that if you're interested. Okay, so obviously you have this entire application. Let's start with some quick stuff that you can usually just go in, find in your app, and then change pretty much right away. I forgot to ask, how many folks in here consider themselves a developer versus somebody in just security? Okay, cool, good. Just want to be sure. You never know at security conferences. I primarily speak at development conferences, so it's a little bit different balance. Okay, so globals. Globals are really, really easy to use, especially when you're first prototyping an application. PHP has the lovely superglobals that are accessible pretty much anywhere. JavaScript, the bane of my existence, has the top level variables, and scoping is all sorts of weird, and this is different everywhere. So you just have to be careful about using those. You'll see them nested like 5 layers down inside of JavaScript functions. They'll be using a variable that was globally defined up top. Super fun. And then Java, they have static variables that you can just reference all over the place. And yes, singletons are global. How many people use singletons on a daily basis? Oh, one brave person. Okay, 2. All right, cool. All right, so the next one up, unfiltered data. You hear this harped about constantly in the securing application presentations and everything. Being sure that everything that you're taking into your application is going through some kind of validation, some kind of filtering, depending on what it is. At the very least, some kind of validation. Ideally, you're not doing too much filtering, because if you start assuming what the user is putting in, then you could potentially allow an attack to come in, and there could be a mistake in your regular expression if you're doing validation that way. So you just have to be careful. But everything that comes in, not just from users, but also from any external source, APIs, even your database, potentially. It just depends on the type of application and how well protected the database is, the database server is, and everything. There's various functions that you can use, like these aren't directly in PHP, but these are in frameworks that are written in PHP. JavaScript, you can actually reference the URL parameters directly, so you can just pull those straight off of there without doing any validation on it. And then similar in Java, you can actually run get query, and it'll give you the query string, and then you can parse them out from there. You always want to pass those into some kind of a validation layer. And I usually recommend coming up with a system where you can have reusable validation. So if you have a user profile, and you pass in a username, password, bio, website address, something like that, you pass that into a user validation object or something like that, so that it's always validated the same way, and then when it comes back out, you know for sure that everything is correct in that data that you gave it, versus trying to do it one-off all over the application, because that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, next one, sensitive logging. This is really easy to forget. It's pretty common. I've seen it in a lot of applications where they just dump a bunch of objects into the log statements or into the logging functions, and they don't think about what's in those objects. Especially users or anything related to auth controls. You could have PII in there. You could have credentials. I've seen people accidentally logging API tokens, or they log everything about their OAuth flow. And so they get all the tokens, they get the refresh tokens, they get all that. And so, yeah, not great. You have to think of them as output. And sometimes the logging server is actually less, or is not as well protected as some of the web systems or other systems that are involved in the application. And so sometimes attackers will actually go after that, get the information they need from there, and then use that to hop onto the web application or whatever it happens to be. Obviously, you want to remove any kind of sensitive information you're logging, and the really tricky part is actually purging the logs. Now, I'm not saying go back to your backup logs and go and purge that. I mean, unless it's a really extreme situation. As long as you have a good cycling policy for your logs, good retention policy and everything, those will fall off eventually. These are the logs that are currently in place, that are currently in the system. Because hopefully, chances are, you're going to find those pieces of information pretty quickly after after they've actually entered the log system, the log servers. And so you can go and purge that information out. So to help with this, I recommend usually only logging identifiers, preferably any internal identifiers that you can, so it's not stuff that's being shown to the user. And then any hard-coded strings that you might have, like error messages or something like that. Okay, wildcards. So one of the main things that I've seen this used for is routing. In applications, there's a lot of the frameworks that'll let you actually do wildcards in your routes. I worked with an application that it had a lot of defined routes, but then the very last one was a wildcard route. And because of the way that the routing system worked, it didn't pay attention to the HTTP verb, like get, post, delete, all that. And so basically it would match, or it wouldn't match a get route for it if it was a post, and then it would hit that wildcard route. So it would go ahead and call that function anyway, because it didn't care about the HTTP verb. It still called that function. So that was super fun. You know, obviously, being specific about it is better. More of the frameworks and more of the tools out there are getting a little bit better about this. They require you to say which verb is actually related to it. You know, my background in PHP, it used to be that a lot of the frameworks just didn't care about that, and then a lot of them got really smart. And now you actually have to say get, post, delete, you know, on the actual route definition. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So you can remove these wildcards or specify the exact matches. You know, obviously, the more exact, the more specific these are, the better. So along the same lines as that wildcard thing where it didn't care about the HTTP verb, I usually recommend splitting out the actions. It's really easy to have one function that handles get, post, put, delete, you know, inside of your code or inside of your controller or something like that. But it's really easy to miss something in there if you're not paying attention, especially if you get, you know, like some of the apps that I've seen, you'll get controller methods that are, you know, 1,000 lines long. Well, if you're putting get, post, put, delete, everything into that same function, there's a pretty high chance that you're going to forget something in there. And something's going to get output, something's going to, you know, some action is going to be taken you didn't intend. So I usually recommend splitting those out. It makes for a little bit more code sometimes, but then you have those separate methods, and you know when it's a get request, I'm going to always go to this particular function in the controller, or you know whatever your functionality happens to be. And then taking advantage of that framework-specific handling, you know, sometimes you can actually define a set and say, for this URL, for this GET request, you know, go here, and then the post and everything. So abstracting those out by actions, and ensure that whatever the method is, you have, you know, appropriate protection for it. You know, usually CSRF tokens for post, put, you know, that kind of thing. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. All right, input handling. How many people love writing validation for input? Yes? Oh, wow, a couple of people. That's surprising, actually. Well, that's, yeah. So what kind of validation do you usually do? Like what kind of data are you usually working with?
It's usually JSON tables.
Okay.
So coming through middleware-based validation.
Okay, cool. You had something?
Mostly sanitizing, looking for, you know, just making sure we're escaping strings and all that.
Okay. Do you escape before you put it in the database?
Most of the time I would hope to do that, yes.
Okay, so you have to be really careful with that, because one of the things, and I had to unfortunately take out a little bit about this as well, some of the templating stuff, if you try escaping before you put into the database or whatever your data source happens to be, when you pull it back out, you've already made the assumption that it's going to be used in whatever context that is. So if your HTML, you know, escaping your tags or something before you put it in, if you pull it back out and you're actually going to use that string in JavaScript, then you're going to have problems. So usually recommend kind of the other way around. So doing the escaping on the output, because there's HTML attributes, JavaScript, XML, JSON. There's all sorts of different contexts. And if you've already escaped it for HTML, then you're, you know, setting yourself up for trouble on the other side. So just a little helpful hint. All right. So when you're looking at your input handling, obviously the goal of all this is to reduce the risk, you know, reduce the security concerns of the app. So you have to go through and kind of locate all those input points. Now, for a larger legacy application, obviously that's going to be a massive undertaking. So what I usually recommend for that is, as the system is being worked on and the different pieces are being updated or added, you take the information about the inputs to that and go back to your threat model and say, here's this piece of the application, let's look at how this data interacts, and then slowly build that out. Because for most applications, most legacy apps that I've seen, I mean, they're big, you know, large code bases. And going through and just saying, okay, we're going to threat model this whole thing. That's going to take, 6 months to a year, easy, just to do that. So if you actually locate those points as you're going, then you can kind of build that out. And sometimes you can also build out pieces of it. So if you have different parts of the application that do different things, you can threat model this, and then you can do the model for this. And then eventually you can make that connection and say, okay, here's how these two pieces interact. Let's talk about that. For input handling, I mentioned the different contexts. You have to be careful because you're not going to escape it quite the same way for each of those different contexts. For JavaScript, if you're using it in a string, you can do the x /x, numeric value. There is actually a way to escape an HTML string inside of JavaScript, or an HTML value inside of JavaScript where it's still going to work correctly as real JavaScript. So you're not going to break anything. It's a little tricky, but. And then going back again, documenting those risk points in the threat model. And if possible, use as much of the internal storage information that you can instead of relying on the user to put in everything every single time. Sometimes it costs a little bit more. There's a little bit more overhead to go in and pull that information out every single time. But if you're using that internal data, then you don't have to worry quite so much about the input and the information that you're getting. All right, validation on adding and updating. So unfortunately, a lot of applications don't do validation. I won't ask for any hands on this one. I don't want to embarrass anybody. I've written them too. Don't worry, I've done it too. Nobody's really immune. But a lot of applications, especially when you see ones that have more of the first startup-y kind of code, when the code base first began, you won't see a whole lot of validation because they're just trying to ramp it up quickly. And then nobody ever went back to that. They just started piling on top of it. Sometimes they don't even know that there's not any validation. They just assume there is, and then they're surprised whenever somebody inputs some malicious data, there's SQL injection or something like that, and they have to go back and they're like throwing their hands up. They have no idea. And that's another thing that doing the modeling and everything can help with, because then you're forced to say, I have these controls in here, that's good to go. I don't have to worry so much about it. It's really easy to fall into the same origin idea, not the same origin as JavaScript. I probably should use a different term for that. But I hear a lot of the development side say, well, why do I have to worry about it? It's just coming from my application. It's my form that they're submitting it from. Except they don't consider that most of the attackers out there are using automated tools. They're probably not even using your website, honestly. And so it's really easy for them to bypass if you have JavaScript validation and you don't back it up with validation on the back end. You have to include that stuff. Now, there's a lot of libraries out there that will help with this. Be sure and vet those libraries, because sometimes, even though you think, oh, it's a validation library, it's going to check everything I need, some of them do better jobs than others. So just be careful with that. And some languages actually have internal functionality that'll let you do validation. There is a PHP function called filtervar, which is kind of odd because you can do filtering and validation with it. But you can define the different rules for your data, and you can pass it the whole array of data, and it'll go through and match against all those rules at one time. There's a lot of libraries that'll do the same kind of thing out there too, so just keep that in mind. And then once you assess those validation needs across the whole app, and if they repeat, that's that reusable validation that I mentioned. You create the functionality to just pass the data in, and it says yes or no, basically. And it's always consistent. And if it fails the validation, fail it right away. I usually recommend doing the validation as the first thing once the data comes in, and not worrying about doing it multiple levels deep, or having it way down in the function, something like that. It's really easy to make that stuff, to forget about that stuff. And then you potentially have something, a developer comes back in, they make a change, and there's some action being taken before the validation completes. And you don't know that because you haven't read the entire function. So doing it right away and failing as soon as that validation fails is a definite recommendation. Sanitization for the data, don't use it as a replacement for validation. I have seen some apps where they tried to sanitize everything that came in, and then they're like, oh yeah, we just assumed that this was what the user meant. Unfortunately, that's a risky idea. And the more assumptions you make about the data, the higher that risk gets. Again, you have to consider the different output contexts, sanitizing and escaping the output correctly for the different contexts. And then if you're going to use sanitization, I recommend that order, validation and then sanitization. Again, don't try too hard on the sanitization. But then if you validate, you're saying, okay, I'm expecting this particular piece of information from the user in this particular format. Now, I can understand things like, if you ask for a social security number, and hopefully you're storing it correctly. If they put it in something with dashes, that's really easy. You can just take out the dashes because it's a known format. Things get really tricky when you start dealing with more free-form text or input from other sources where you may not 100% know what it's going to look like. So you just have to be careful with that. All right, access controls. How am I doing? Okay, good. All right, so access controls. I mentioned, working from the outside in, you kind of determine the different access controls that you already have, authentication and authorization. You need to determine the coverage of those. That threat model will help with that. And you need to be sure that you're only protecting, or you're protecting things adequately and not doing any more than that. Remember the idea of simplicity in all this? If you go through your application and you start building out that model, or as you're piecing through it and improving it, improving that legacy code, if you notice an auth control that's either not necessarily being used or not necessarily being used correctly, or is not even needed. There's a lot of times that I've seen applications where they've implemented 5 controls for one piece of the application. It's like, you don't need all that a lot of the times. Usually 1 or 2 is going to cover most needs for that. So be sure that if you see over-engineering, you see any kind of extra stuff like that, you sit down and you plan it out and say, okay, what's the absolute minimum that we need for that? And then you go in and start, reversing that kind of stuff out. I've seen a lot of cases where okay, so it sounds easy, but I've seen a lot of cases where it is super difficult to actually go in and pull those security controls out, because a lot of times they'll interact with other systems. And so one system over here is referencing this point or is using this point with OAuth, and then another over here is coming in with just a straight-on username and password. And so it gets tricky when you have to consider external systems using it as well. And it's not operating in isolation. It's not just, here's the web application, we use it that way. Credentials, you have to be careful, very, very careful about hard-coded credentials. If the source is ever breached, or if they're able to do any kind of command injection or local file includes or anything like that, they could potentially read those files in, output the contents, and then they would have those hard-coded values directly. Usually, one of the previous speakers recommended something like Vault, where it's actually stored off and protected. Having that kind of thing is much better. You could have usernames or tokens or passwords. I've seen all of these in applications. It's really super easy when you're creating, a new class or putting together a new service or something like that to just hard code those values and then go on with it. But then you forget about that stuff, and then 5 years later it bites you. So what you need to do is extract those values. Unfortunately, this step can also sometimes include expunging them from your repository, because if an attacker is able to gain access to that repository, then they can still see those values because they're still a part of the Git history. So you have to go back in. There's ways to rewrite the Git history and overwrite that stuff and take it back out. But that's really tricky, especially if you have multiple commits you have to do it in. So you just have to be sure. And then protect them adequately. Take them, put them out in an external service like Vault or an system. There's external services like third-party services that'll actually handle some of this stuff for you. Stormpath was one of them before they got acquired. They actually handled all the authentication stuff. They protected it with high-level crypto on their systems, and all you had to do was call out to it, and it would do, you know, authentication, it would do authorization. You could have complex rules on there. I think Okta kept some of it around, but I'm not sure. I know they allow that kind of stuff too, but I think it's a little more expensive. So, let's see. Nope, that's good. All right, access control on endpoints. You have to consider whether the endpoint is public, private, or sometimes it's conditional, depending on who's using the system. You know, public URLs, public endpoints, those are obviously ones that are accessible to anybody. They may not need as many controls on there as some of the other functionality. Private ones, you know, you want to have them protected adequately. And conditional ones kind of get really tricky because you may have situations where certain users have access to only certain pieces of functionality inside of that endpoint. And so you have to kind of do these evaluations internally. So it can get a little complicated, especially with just role-based access controls or something like that. You can start with the most used endpoints when you're doing your evaluations on where to start this refactoring. The logs are usually super helpful for this. If you're logging, you know, like an action log where you can go in and look and see what endpoints are most hit. You know, you'll have like your login, reset password, that kind of stuff. You don't want to be sure that those are protected at a minimum. And then you can potentially protect them at different levels. You know, you can do it at the web server level, you can do it at the code level. You know, you can kind of stack those and do that defense in depth idea. And again, see if there's a simpler way, because simple is good. All right, users. When you go into your system, go ahead and look at the different user types that you have defined. You know, at the very minimum, it's going to be users and admins. That's pretty traditional kind of thing. But then you're going to start having groups inside of there. You're going to have multiple access levels. So if you have a good grid of that, it's super helpful. So you can say, here's my types of users. Here's the functionality that they're supposed to be able to work with. You know, and you can get as specific as you want. It's like, here's the functionality and here's what they can do with it. But having that grid of users kind of gives you a good overview of your application and the different people that are interacting with it. And I've seen some groups that have taken that even farther and creating a persona for it. We at Duo actually have different personas for the different people that use our systems. And so we can get a better feeling for how they're using our systems and what we can do to, you know, ensure it's controlled correctly and, you know, ensure the features are good. You have to think about whether your access controls are dependent on features or dependent on user level. You know, sometimes you're going to have a feature in the application that's protected the same way for all of your users. But sometimes, you know, you're going to have a user-focused approach where, you know, certain users have access to certain things. And then I mentioned that administration between administration and user as that kind of basic level. All right, so when you're adding new controls, hopefully you're only doing this when you absolutely have to. You need to look at the controls you have and see if any of them can be consolidated with what you're talking about adding in. And then see if there's anything that's missing. You know, you might come across a certain part of the system when you're thinking about adding, you know, OAuth to a certain part of the API. You know, maybe some of it's public, some of it's protected. You know, if there's missing controls on a certain piece, you know, it might have been missed in the past whenever somebody was just, you know, dumping code in there and getting it out quickly. So, you know, if you can determine if there's anything missing as a part of, you know, any new controls that you're adding, that's going to help you build out that model as well. Think about any third-party tools or libraries. Be sure and vet those. Again, it's really super easy with like NPM or Packagist or, you know, what's the Python one? PyPy or, yeah, the pip. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. It's really easy to grab those and just pull them in and be like, oh yeah, this does exactly what I want, except you didn't actually vet the code first. So there was, what was the NPM one? That was like, there was a, which one? Left bad, yeah. There was a malicious package that was uploaded because it expired, or I forget what it was. Somebody, oh no, I think they breached the credentials for it and they uploaded a malicious version of it instead, or it was something like that. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, you have to be really careful about third-party packages. And then again, simple is good. I'm going to keep saying this over and over again because legacy apps are complex and simplifying them is obviously an end goal. So any kind of new controls, this is just some of the ones. CSRF tokens, I've seen them injected automatically on the rendering of the page at the view layer, so that it's automatically built out. So you have a form in your output, and this piece automatically puts the CSRF token functionality in there for you. Just so you don't have to specifically state, or specifically have that field in there. You can just kind of forget about it, and then the post automatically processes that as it comes through. You can add in encryption of data using those libraries. You have to be careful, again, because crypto is pretty easy to get wrong. And so be sure that the libraries that you use there are vetted, and are doing things correctly. They got the right key length and all that kind of good stuff. This is one of the sections that I had to take out because I had a whole big thing on templating. Implementing a templating library is going to take a lot of the burden off of you as far as output escaping and ensuring it's escaped correctly for the context. It's really easy, especially when you're just spitting out code and adding new features, to just output the variable directly, or just assume it's always going to be a certain value. But having a templating library like that, or implemented inside of your application, is going to make that a whole lot easier. I have seen there's some that'll do kind of a hybrid template approach, to where you can pass it the template, and if it's something that matches, like handlebars or something like that, it'll use that particular piece for the templating. And I've also seen some where they're full-on template. So you have to migrate the whole template, the whole view, or whatever it is, into this templating system's format, so that it can correctly put those values in there. And it doesn't let you directly reference them. Like, for example, the Twig templating engine for PHP, you have to migrate over to Twig templates, to their structure, because you can't just output using PHP directly in a template. Now, that's a good thing, don't get me wrong. But it can be a hassle if you're moving an entire application over from just a direct output kind of view layer to something more like a templating library, where you're forced into that kind of thing. So just evaluate what your needs are and see if you can move over to that kind of system, or if you need to do something a little more in-house that's a little more customized to your application, you can do that as well. There are tons of guides out there as far as output escaping, for all the different contexts, and I'm happy to send those links out if anybody's interested. There's tons of different ways to get that, or tons of different tools to get that done. So, and of course, I would be remiss working for Duo if I didn't mention adding in two-factor authentication. Honestly, it is easier than ever to add this in. You can use our service to integrate with your application, or you can even use things like Google Authenticator that has the rotating numbers based on the RFC. Pretty much any app, our app, the Authy app, there's even a Google Authenticator app that handles that. And all you have to do is you store the seed for that particular user. And then when they come in and they log in and you kick over to the 2FA functionality, you're only referencing that seed. You're not having to hit an external service. It's all just right there because it's based on that RFC. And if you have, like I said, our application, multiple applications support that because it is an open protocol. And it's super easy. Really, it's like the lowest barrier for a lot of two-factor implementations. It's a 6-digit number. It changes every minute, I think, roughly. And so it's really not that much of a burden. Now, users tend to complain about stuff. They don't understand, well, I put in my username and password. Isn't that good enough? Why do I have to put in another code to prove who I am? It's difficult to explain sometimes, but that's where a good security education program internal to your company is going to help. It's a little easier for ours because it's the product we sell. But a lot of times, you can actually just sit down if there's one particular user or a group of users that just don't understand. Maybe sit down and have the security group give a presentation about two-factor and why it's good, or different kinds of access controls. Honestly, say here's what usernames and passwords are. Here's why you should have good passwords. Here's what a good password is. And here's the benefits of two-factor authentication. Here's how it works in our company. All that kind of stuff. So having a good education among the company is good. Okay, and finally, so if you have all this stuff and you're going back in, you're refactoring for simplicity, changing your access controls, building out your threat model, which everybody's going to do, right? Everybody's going to go home and start building a threat model. Yes, yes, please. The next step is changing the development practices. Honestly, this is one of the hardest parts. The code stuff is relatively easy. You can go in, you can change code. I mean, it's there. It's set. There's a certain way to do that. But when you start changing your development process, start implementing new secure coding practices. You're going to need a little bit of guidance, obviously. That's where some of the AppSec people come in, if you have those specifically. But a lot of times, the people in this room are going to be the AppSec people. If you just think of yourself as a developer, think of yourself as a security developer, honestly, because that's part of the job. I see a lot of development organizations where they're like, okay, our tests pass QA, the code passed the lint. They go down the checklist of all the tech functionality, but they don't think about the security aspect of their job. So that should be built in from the very beginning. That's one of the goals of security development or secure development practices, is having that built in from the very start, so that you're thinking about this methodology as you're creating your code. And if you're fortunate enough to have somebody you can go and connect with, that's great. If not, then just start reading about it. If you're unfamiliar with a certain control that you have in your system, maybe you weren't the one that put it in there. Just go out there and start reading about it. Educate yourself, and that'll go a long way. Some groups will have manual security code reviews, just like the regular code reviews that a lot of groups have, where they look at the quality of the code, they say, oh, this doesn't follow our conventions, that kind of thing. If you add one additional check in there and have those security checks and just say, why are you using MD5? Why are you, hashing it that way? Just little things like that can go a long way to helping the overall security of the code base. And then if you kind of establish this pattern of security refactoring, ideally taking a day, or even just a day every month, and just looking at the code base and saying, these are the particular pain points that we have, maybe looking at your threat model if you have it. These are the pain points that we have. Let's go in and figure out how we can do this better, or how we can improve this particular part of the system. And so going in and just spending some time refactoring that piece, making it simpler, making it easier to understand. Developers down the line will thank you very much for it. There's different things you can do here. You could integrate tools and services. There's different scanners, third-party services, pen testing, bug bounties. Is anybody working with a bug bounty right now? No? No? You're nodding, but you're not raising your hand. Is it internal, or do you go through like BugCrowd or? Oh, okay.
I'm not actively involved yet.
Oh, okay, okay. So I was, at my previous role, I was responsible for the bug bounty for our particular piece of the functionality. We were an acquisition for the main company. And I have to say that I had no idea that running a bug bounty program was quite as much work as it was. So if you're looking for something to help with the overall security of your application, be very careful with jumping to a bug bounty. You have to have a good process behind it, a good triage process, a good development process, and somebody to basically manage that. At least one person, preferably more. But it's a lot more complex than just saying, here's our application, here's how to sign up for it, send us bugs. So we didn't quite anticipate, we thought we were in a pretty good security stance, but we didn't quite anticipate the level of bugs, and it was a private bounty too. I think we got 200 bugs in the first 3 weeks, something like that. Yeah, it was not great. We thought we were doing all right, but clearly not. Fortunately, most of those things were fixable in 1 or 2 places, because a lot of them were reported multiple times, but it was in a reusable component. So it did make it a little bit easier. It trimmed down those a lot. And that's one of the other aspects of this. You're dealing with researchers that are external to the company. And so sometimes you have to try to explain why, whenever they fix the bug in this one particular thing, they're not getting awarded for these 5 other things that are pretty similar. It's like, well, we're not going to award you because we fixed it for this one. So it gets really complicated. It's a whole different thing. A lot of companies will do pen testing. They'll have a company come in every once in a while and do it. There's certain compliance requirements around that, so you actually have to have companies come in and do it. There is definitely varying levels of companies. So if you come across one that works really well and you work really well with, and they have good communication about stuff, and they don't just toss the report over the wall and say, okay, have fun. Potentially use them again, because I've dealt with a lot of pen testing companies that they do that. They come back with the results and then they just say, here's the report, have fun, And whenever we try to ask them questions about things, maybe the report wasn't clear on a certain point, it's like pulling teeth to get that information back out of them. So just be really careful about, like I said, if you have good communication and work well together with one of those companies, maybe stick with them. Several of the speakers have mentioned this, but obviously scanners, they'll only get you so far, whether it's an internal service or an external service. I've used White Hat in the past for their Sentinel product for the external scanning. It's worked pretty well, but then I ran internal scanning tools against it, and it found a ton more than theirs did. So you have to be really careful about the information that scanners give you, static scanning, dynamic scanning. Honestly, the best kind of scan that you can do is having your developers go in once a month, or once a sprint or something like that, and go in and actually find these issues. I forget who it was that was talking about it. It was one of the keynotes, but actually encouraging the development groups to get in there and kind of own the security of the application. And that's assuming that they've done their job, at the very beginning, and say, the security of the application is something that we're building in from the start. It's a whole lot easier to come back in at the end and say, okay, let's find the problems that are still in there, and and go from there. And then refactoring in those bite-sized pieces, related to current development. Obviously, it's a lot easier as you're adding things or as you're changing things to check those controls, like I mentioned earlier, and really build out that culture of security. So it doesn't require you to be a security expert for any of this stuff. There's a lot of this stuff that honestly is already out there. It's common knowledge. It's just more of applying it in specific ways to applications. You may have had an effort where all of your templates, you went through a massive refactor and moved all your templates over to a template engine. Well, obviously, you don't have to worry quite as much about that, as long as your development processes have changed to say, you need to use this templating engine. This is how we do things now. You just have to be careful with that. And I think that is it for me. That's me on Twitter. I'm constantly tweeting about stuff. Sometimes it's security, sometimes it's not. And that websec.io site, I write articles for it. A lot of them are kind of PHP centric, but there's also a lot of stuff that's just general security knowledge. So, and that's it. Any questions? I think everybody's really tired at this point. Ending a little early, so that's probably good. Yeah?
So when you mentioned the endpoints, whether they're conditional, they can be public and private, do you think it's better to split those out so that you have public or private endpoints and not anything in between?
So it depends. So you have the public, the ones that are always public, the ones that are always private. The conditional ones are the ones that it might depend on what kind of user is accessing it, maybe what kind of data is being output. Maybe if it's an admin, they get more data than a normal user would get. Or you can do kind of what you're talking about in restricting it at the endpoint level, where if they're an admin, they can access it, and if they're a user, they can't access it. That's more of what you're asking about. Yeah, splitting it out in that case is a better case. You know, a lot of this is, it depends, you know, unfortunately, because the applications are going to be different. There's going to be little quirks to it. But yeah, if it's that kind of a delineation, then yeah, probably splitting it out is going to be a better approach. It's going to be simpler in the end because you know for sure that this is accessible by this person and this one's by this person. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yes.
That's something not even remotely related to this talk, but I noticed,
Okay.
I noticed you had a Dev2 sticker on your,
Which one?
the black Dev sticker.
Oh, yeah.
Do you contribute to, do you have any articles up on that platform?
It's on my list.
Okay.
I haven't written for it yet, but I've got an account, and you know, I think I've got a couple of drafts that I've written up, but I haven't finalized them or anything.
Cool.
So, it's a good site, by the way. I got my lovely sticker collection. I added my LASCON sticker. I highly recommend anybody that has stickers on their laptop. Ooh, lovely.
Any other questions?
No?
Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Chris.